Hello, it's great to see you all here, and welcome back to the seventh talk of our international speaker series on rethinking cultural constructions of law in East Asia. I'm Li Chen, an associate professor of Chinese history and law at the University of Toronto in Canada. Professor Taisu Zhang of Yale Law School and I have co-organized this series to facilitate more fruitful conversations among scholars of East Asian legal cultures, histories, and societies from multiple disciplinary perspectives. Today is my great pleasure to again introduce the speaker, but also to thank the three co-sponsoring institutions. The University of Toronto, especially its Faculty of Law, Cornell Law School, and Yale Law School. Also, I want to mention that our next talk after this will be given by Professor Rachel Stern of UC Berkeley Law School on March 26th. And I hope many of you will join that talk as well. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Sida Liu. And Professor Sida Liu is an associate professor of sociology and law at the University of Toronto. He received his bachelor's degree from Peking University Law School and his PhD degree in sociology from the University of Chicago. Professor Liu has conducted very extensive empirical research on China's legal reform and legal profession. His current project examines the influence of colonialism and authoritarianism on the professions in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In addition to his empirical work, he has also written on theories of law, professions, and social spaces. Professor Liu is the author of 3 books in Chinese and English. Most recently, one book entitled Criminal Defense in China, The Politics of Lawyers at Work, co-authored with Terence Halliday and published by Cambridge University Press in 2016. Professor Liu has also published many articles in leading journals in law and social science disciplines. He's a faculty fellow at the American Bar Foundation, as well as an affiliated scholar of the U.S. Asia Law Institute at New York University and the Center on the Legal Profession at Harvard Law School. In 2016-2017, he was also a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. We also have 2 distinguished scholars as commentators. Now I want to invite Professor Taisu Zhang to introduce the 2 commentators. And by the way, and the title of Professor Liu Sida's talk today is Cage for the Birds, Social Transformation of Chinese Law in 1999 to 2019. Now, Taisu.
Great. So we have, per our norm, 2 commentators for the talk. The first is Professor Wang Juan, who was associate professor of political science at McGill University, Canada. Her research is about contentious politics and law and politics with a country focus on China. Her works have appeared in numerous journals, including Problems of Post-Communism, Crime, Law and Social Change, the China Quarterly, Journal of East Asian Law, Journal of East Asian Studies, Asian Journal of Law and Society, Modern China, Journal of Contemporary China, as well as the Journal of Chinese Political Science. Her first book, titled The Sinews of State Power, The Rise and Demise of the Cohesive Local State in Rural China, was published by Oxford in 2017. So second commentator is Professor Li Ji, who is the John S. and Marilyn Long Professor of U.S. China Business and Law at the UC Irvine Law School. His research interests include Chinese law and politics, multinational business associations, cross-border dispute resolution, and empirical legal studies. His first book, The Clash of Capitalisms, Chinese Companies in the United States, was published by Cambridge in 2018, and it examines the adaptation of Chinese multinationals to U.S. legal and regulatory institutions. He is currently working on the sequel, which explores how Chinese multinationals, especially those under state ownership, resolve disputes in the U.S. So we'd like to welcome both commentators and thank them for their participation. Yes, that floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank my good friends and colleagues, Chen Li and Taisu, for giving this opportunity to present a new paper here. And also thank all of you for being here, either in the early morning or in the late evening, depending on where you are. So let me share my screen so we can get started. So this, the paper, as Chen Li said, is titled "A Cage for the Birds on the Social Transformation of Chinese Law, 1999 to 2019." So this is a forthcoming article in the review journal called the China Law and Society Review. So it's a journal basically reviewing kind of development of Chinese law and society in different aspects. So I want to first kind of say a few words about kind of the background of this paper, how I started to write a paper like this, because this is not a conventional social science study, as many of you probably got the sense from the title, because it's about birds, it's about cages. It's not really about law or lawyers, things I usually study. So the story behind this is that about 3 years ago, I think 3 years ago, I got an invitation from Mary Gallagher and Nico Housen, two of our colleagues at University of Michigan, to a conference that they want to host in Michigan. I think the conference happened in October 2019, basically before COVID. And then when I got the invitation, they asked me, along with many other people, I think the conference has like 80 participants or something, to kind of present something kind of different. Not like a typical social science research or a legal research paper, but kind of what they call a thought piece, or kind of a thought reflection piece, basically to reflect on the development of Chinese law over 40 years, basically from ever since 1979, the reform period, and then from the aspect of your expertise. So of course, when I got the invitation, I thought about it. I thought, probably they were thinking about, asking me to write something about Chinese lawyers, because that's kind of where my main expertise lies. But it just happens that, when I got the invitation, I was at this point that I really had no mood to write another paper about Chinese lawyers, because I've been written so much about Chinese lawyers for the past 15 years, right? So I decided to write about birds instead of lawyers. So that's how this paper came from. So, I mean, the reason I wanted to write about birds is because I really wanted to kind of provide at least a fresh perspective. I can't say there's anything new in the paper, because I'm basically building the arguments and the framework on other people's research. But kind of at least a fresh perspective to think about what happened in the Chinese legal system for the past 20 years, not 40 years. I didn't start from 1979, but I started from 1999, basically for the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And why did I start from 1999? And why did I use the metaphor of the birds? Of course, it has a lot to do with this classic book written by Stanley Lupman called "Bird in a Cage: Legal Reforms in China After Mao." And so this is a book many of you in this room probably read or have at least heard of. It was published in 1999, precisely kind of the year, kind of the starting point of this paper I'm presenting here. So Professor Lupman, of course, is a very distinguished law professor, but also a lawyer, kind of writing about China's legal system. So this is a book, is probably, I think even today, remain the best study about kind of the Chinese legal system, not since 1979, but since 1949, actually. Half of the book is about actually the Mao era, and then the reform era after that. But you can see it's called "Bird in a Cage" because Professor Lopman actually in the book used this very interesting metaphor. Kind of, his idea was Chinese law in the 1990s, kind of up to the point, late 1990s when he was writing this book, was like a little bird trapped in a cage. Right, and of course, I mean, he acknowledged in the book that he was not kind of this is not originally from him. He was also borrowing from someone else, which is Chen Yun, who was kind of one of China's top leaders in the 1980s, kind of a peer of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. So Chen Yun actually first used the metaphor "bird in a cage," 笼中鸟, in the early 80s, talking about China's economic reform. So the idea is that the economy was like a bird in the early 1980s, but Chen Yun, as a more conservative leader, kind of he was advocating for the socialist planning system to continue relevance of the socialist planning system. So Chen Yun's idea was that this little bird of the economic reform needs to be confined in a cage of the socialist planning system. So that's kind of where kind of the metaphor "bird in a cage" was kind of first used in the reform era. And then when Professor Lopman, almost 20 years later, was published this book "Bird in a Cage," he used the same metaphor as Chen Yun because he was almost kind of lamenting the fact that by the late 1990s, what happened is that Chinese economy, the economic bird already kind of flew out of the cage. Clearly, of course, ever since the 1990s, China was building the so-called socialist market economy, right? So the economic aspect of Chinese society became a lot more market-driven and a lot less confined by the planning system or by politics. But on the other hand, Lobman argues that if you look at the legal system up until the late 1990s, the legal system was still a kind of a bird trapped in a cage, right? What is the cage? The cage, of course, is the political system and all the so-called Chinese characteristics, all kinds of 中国特色, in the political system that confines the Chinese law as a bird. But on the other hand, Lobman also argues in the book with this metaphor that, on the other hand, like Chinese law in the 1990s was this kind of a chirping and stirring bird. Although it was trapped in this cage, it was hard for the bird to break out of the cage. The bird was actually very active and very, a lot of things are happening. So it was a very hopeful time. For those of you who are in this room who are, old enough to remember the 1990s, that was a very hopeful time. A lot of legal changes were happening. A lot of, that's where the action, when the action was, the 1990s. A lot of laws were promulgated, and also a lot of institutional reforms were happening in China. Even if some reforms were not happening, people were hopeful. Someday those things will happen, right? So it was kind of, to a large extent, the bird in the cage metaphor in Lobman basically described this kind of not just a status quo of Chinese law in the 90s, but also almost his hope that someday the bird will break out of the cage. So that's kind of it's a long explanation about like why I use this bird cage metaphor. But then what happened is that, of course, when I actually started to write this paper, I of course I reread Lobman's book. I did that in 2019, basically exactly 20 years after the book was published. Then I realized something very interesting and serious, which is like 20 years later, Chinese law is not a bird anymore. That kind of metaphor that Chinese law is a little bird trapped in the political cage someday, trying to break free, it doesn't work anymore. I mean, I think more likely, I more and more see Chinese law becoming a cage rather than a bird. It's become a cage that trap other birds. Okay? So that's why I call this paper the title "Cage for the Birds." So I want to do two things basically in this paper. The first is to look at this whole social process by which China's legal system was kind of did this almost incredible transformation from a bird into a cage over 20 years. And the second thing, I also want to look at all the birds trapped in this new legal cage of Chinese law. So those are kind of the two aspects of my presentation today. So then what happened in Chinese law after 1999, right? So why did I say that, like I feel like Chinese law is not a bird anymore, now it become a cage? I want to start from two quotes to give you a sense of kind of the some of the issues. So in the Bird in the Cage book, Stanley Lobman's book, toward the conclusion of the book, he actually had this very interesting statement. He said, because of the absence of a unifying concept of law and a considerable fragmentation of authority, China does not have a legal system. With the word system, emphasize the word system. So what he meant is that because he was looking at Chinese law, China's legal system up to the 1990s, what he observed is that there are plenty of statutes, plenty of legal institutions being constructed, but it's highly fragmented. I mean, there's like a great amount of fragmentation of authority, and also like internal coherence was very weak, right? So in that sense, he was saying China does not have a legal system. So there are a bunch of laws, but they're not systematic, right? So that's kind of the idea about. He said China doesn't have a legal system in 1999. But on the other hand, the very interesting thing is that if you kind of fast forward about 12 years, in 2011, during the National People's Congress, because every year there's the two meetings, the National People Congress and the CPPCC meeting. This year's meeting is going to happen pretty soon. So during that meeting, Wu Bangguo, who was the chairman of the National People's Congress at the time, made a very bold and important statement during the NPC speech in March 2011. He said, the socialist system with Chinese characteristics has already been constituted, and there's law to abide by. In Chinese, 有法可依, in China's economic, political, cultural, societal, and ecological construction. In other words, basically, by 2011, the chair of the National People's Congress declared that the construction of the Chinese legal system is complete. Now China has a coherent, complete legal system for all the aspects: economic, political, cultural, societal, ecological aspect of Chinese life. Right. So if you compare these two statements, it's actually the contrast can be more salient, right? Like how could this even possible in 12 years? From China does not have a legal system to China has a social legal system with Chinese characteristics already completed, right? Of course, I'm a sociologist of law, right? So I look at the Chinese legal system not just in terms of what's on the books, but more in terms of how law works in practice. So from a sociological perspective, when I reread Lobman's book, and also thinking about Wu Bangguo's kind of announcement, I found both arguments actually problematic. I think the Lobman statement, the problem with the statement is that if you argue that China didn't have a legal system because there was a considerable fragmentation of authority, but that's true everywhere almost. If you look at the United States, if you look at Canada, if you look at the UK, if you look at any major countries in the world have a kind of large scale jurisdiction, has a considerable fragmentation of authority. I don't have to give you many examples. I mean, you can just think of the example what happened in the US, for example, in the past few years. You can see the considerable fragmentation of authority at work. If you look at Canada, look at other places, you see the same thing. So that's really not kind of the reason to say that China doesn't have a legal system just because the authorities are fragmented. So I mean, I think that's kind of the problem with the Lobman statement. But if you think about Wu Bangguo's announcement, it's also problematic. Why? Because it's just basically declare, oh, now we have a comprehensive legal system, but only focusing on the black letter law on the books. If you look at black letter law today, you have Chinese law is even more advanced, of course, than 10 years ago. We're in 2021 now. So of course, the legal system, on paper, there are a lot of laws. There are like hundreds of laws passed by the National People's Congress. There are like tens of thousands of statutes, passed by different levels of the state and the Congress, right? So there are a lot of laws out there, and the internal coherence and all these things are vastly improved. But that's only the very first step to think about the legal system, especially if you think about the legal system from a social science perspective, because having law on the books doesn't mean that these laws are actually working effectively in practice. So there's a huge gap between what social legal scholars usually call law between law on the books and law in action, right? So that's Wu Bangguo's announcement clearly ignored what's happening of law in action, right? So, but nevertheless, clearly something profound happened in the Chinese legal system in the past 20 years. How to actually capture all the changes from 1999 to 2019? I think in the paper I argue that there are actually two important processes that happened during these 20-year period, basically the first two decades of the 21st century. These two processes that kind of converted the bird of Chinese law into a cage. So these two things, I call them internal institutionalization and party inscription. So I mean, these two things didn't happen simultaneously. I think the internal institutionalization happened a little earlier, roughly from the mid 1990s to the early 2010s, basically. Happened around 15 to 20 years, less than 20 years. And then the party inscription happened more recently, mostly in the past decade, in the past 10 years, especially after Xi Jinping came to power. So that's kind of, you see this process of party inscription. But altogether, these two things basically converted the Chinese law from a kind of this chirping and singing bird confined in a political cage into a cage in itself, kind of can be used by the party and by the state for different purposes. Right? So let me explain a little bit about what I mean by internal institutionalization and party inscription. So internal institutionalization, what I mean is that basically precisely in opposite to Lobman's observation in 1999, what you observed, what I observed at least in the past 20 years after that, is that the internal complexity and the internal coherence and the what Max Weber would call formal rationality of the Chinese legal system vastly improved over the 20 years. I mean, of course, I mean there are many indicators of this. For example, if you just simply look at the codes, just look at the law on the books. If you look at all the codes, the PRC law made by the National People's Congress, in the late 1990s, when I was still in law school, I was at Beida, Peking University, in the late 90s to the early 2000s. During that time, I still remember only in my second year in law school, China had its first contract law, 合同法. Right? Before that, there were like a contract law for foreign investment. There are different bits and pieces, but there was no unified contract law. Right? And then property law, 物权法, came into being after I finished law school. Right? I mean, it didn't actually, it was not passed until 2007, if I remember correctly. And also tort law, there was no tort law. There was no labor contract law, or there was no kind of law on, I mean, basically the huge areas of administrative law didn't even exist. Like I learned administrative law, I think third year in law school. It was all foreign administrative law, comparative law, because China only had an administrative litigation law, which was passed in 1989, before the Tiananmen student movement. But after that, it was not really quite used a lot until kind of at least 10 years later. And administrative license law, administrative sanctions law, all these kind of 行政处罚法, 行政许可法, all these major administrative codes were actually not made until the 2000s, right? So you see what happened is that that's again, go back to Lobman's statement. That was one reason Lobman said China didn't have a legal system, because a lot of these major codes were missing. But when you get to the period when Wu Bangguo was announcing the announcement, you see all these things has already been kind of established. Kind of the legal system become a lot more hierarchical, functional, and also internally coherent. So that's kind of one aspect of this. But of course, and this is just one of many aspects of internal institutionalization. If you look at the legal profession, develop the legal profession, and the development of the courts and all these things, you see this internal institutionalization process happening too. For the sake of time, I won't go into those aspects. But basically, that I think about 15 years, you see this great vast improvement of the formal rationality of the Chinese legal system. That's what I call internal institutionalization. When I get to the later part, I will give you more specific examples. And party inscription is another process. So this is a more political process, right? It basically means that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, especially after 2012, after Xi Jinping came to power, gradually reasserted its dominance over the legal system. I mean, some of you might say, this. I mean, what do you mean? I mean, of course, the legal system always under the leadership and the dominance of the party. What I mean is that if you compare how the party talk about the legal system. Sorry, hear some noise on the background. Yeah, we have some lovely child.
And actually, I was trying to find who hasn't mute him or herself. So again,
Okay.
just to repeat, all the people in the audience should mute themselves unless he or she is speaking. Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Sida.
Okay. So yeah, I was saying like the party inscription basically happened after Xi Jinping came to power. Basically, like the idea is that if you compare how the party actually deal with the legal system before that, you will soon realize, I mean, at least up until the 2000s, you rarely see the word party in the formal law in the Chinese legal system. Of course, the party is everywhere. The party influence how the court works, how the legal profession works, and etc., how the police works, obviously. But if you look at the law on paper, you don't actually find the party in a lot of places, and you don't see the party is visible kind of visibly in the kind of a dominating the legal system explicitly. And why is that? I mean, so you might even say there's this veil of law. Kind of the party was kind of hiding behind a veil of law. So the legal system almost become a cover, kind of for the party. And the reason for that, I mean, there are many reasons for that, of course. And kind of I think one important reason is that ever since the 1980s, I think the Chinese Communist Party realized that in order for the country to have economic reform, economic growth, opening it up, attracting foreign investment and etc., you need a kind of a modern legal system, at least a legal system that looks rational, looks modern, looks free, or looks autonomous from the party, right? So for at least 30 years, I think from the 1980s to the 2000s, the Communist Party actually didn't try very hard to inscribe itself into Chinese law. So if you look at different, I mean, all the way from, meaning the Constitution, the preamble, of course, has something to do with the Communist Party, but even the constitutional law or other aspects of Chinese law, you don't see the party very visible in the law. And you don't even see the party very visible in the daily operation of a lot of things. The party, of course, was controlling for example, the political legal committee, the Zhengfawei, of course, controlling the law. We all know this, as if you study the Chinese legal system. But you don't see the Zhengfawei, the political legal committee, or the say the adjudication committee in courts. They directly, what was written into the documents, into the papers. There's no inscription. I think that's the point. And if you, for example, if you look at the legal profession, I mean, for a long time, the Chinese lawyers were quite autonomous from the party ever since they were privatized in the 1990s. If you look at the 2000s, I did a lot of field work, interviews with Chinese lawyers in the 2000s. Nobody really mentions the party. Nobody cares about the party. The lawyers were outside of the Chinese state. The party was not really quite imminently visible to the legal profession. But that started to change, I think, quite dramatically in the past 10 years. So in the past 10 years, what you see is that the party started to actually inscribe itself as the explicit and supreme power in the, now the cage of Chinese law. So now you see the party everywhere, in different kind of, in the statutes, in the court system, and also in the legal profession. And to give you some examples, for example, like now that there's the national supervision commission, the Jianchaowei, which I will talk about in more detail in a minute. But basically, it's kind of converting the party disciplinary system into kind of write that into the formal legal system. Party disciplinary system used to be separate from the legal system. And also, if you look at the lawyers, kind of, law firms and bar associations, they all have party cells and even party committees. The largest law firm in China, Dacheng, now is part of Dentons, the largest law firm in the world. And Dacheng has, more than 4,000 lawyers in China, and it has a party committee because there are enough party members in the law firm to have a party committee. And even the smaller law firm have party cells. These things used to be very symbolic, 10 years ago. But today, I think the party is actually having much more visible influence over Chinese lawyers, no matter your party members or not. And also, if you look at the judicial exam, for example, Rachel Stern at Berkeley, who's our next speaker, I think, for this series, wrote a paper a few years ago looking at the Chinese judicial exam, the Sifa Kaoshi, and realized there's also politicization of the questions in the judicial exam. Also has strengthening the visibility of the party. So you can see that's I'm just giving a few examples to show that's what I mean by party inscription. So the party is actually moved to the front stage from the backstage, basically. Now the party doesn't need the veil of law anymore. It's just directly asserting its dominance over the entire legal system, and of course not just the legal system, but other sphere of Chinese life as well. So that's what I mean by party inscription. So basically, what I'm arguing here is that if you want to understand the social transformation of Chinese law in the past 20 years, these are two important social processes to help think about what happened. So it's not really kind of because a lot of like in the past 10 years, Carl Minzner, my friend Carl Minzner wrote a paper called China's Turn Against Law, and then Tai Su and Tom Ginsburg wrote a paper called China's Turn Toward Law. But it's not like a linear change of toward law or against law. I think there are some underlying social processes that happen in the past 20 years. I hope these two that I identified here can help us thinking about different aspects of the legal system. And I will give you a few examples of that. So that's kind of what I mean by, Chinese law is changing from a bird to a cage. But then, of course, now if the Chinese law is not a bird, it's a cage anymore, then the next question, of course, is then what are the birds? Right? Who are the birds actually now confined in this cage? Right? So that's the second part of this study I want to talk about. So I thought about it. I think there are at least 4 different kind of birds that are currently trapped in the cage of Chinese law. I call them hawks, crows, sparrows, and ostriches. So I have a photo, an image of each on this slide. So hawks are what I mean by usually the party and government officials who are potentially under the supervision of the party disciplinary system and the kind of the system of anti-corruption, right? So that I call them hawks. I draw the idea of hawks from the kind of Chairman Mao has this very famous poem called 沁园春雪, Snow. Has this very famous sentence called 一代天骄成吉思汗 只识弯弓射大雕. The English is like that proud son of heaven, Genghis Khan only knows only knows shooting hawks using his bow, right? So the idea is of a hawks is like like if you think about it, like what Xi Jinping is doing in the anti-corruption campaign is basically shooting hawks in a sense, right? So I call these kind of party and government officials hawks. Crows are the political activists. So they are the people like, activists, lawyers, feminist activists, labor activists, or environmental activists. All these, they're the opposite of hawks. Hawks are people inside the system, or what we usually call 体制内 in Chinese. And the crows are the people outside of the legal system, try to challenge and make trouble for the political system. And so they are the crows. And the sparrows are the kind of the netizens, or the citizens on the internet, all these kind of internet users in China, millions of internet users, they're the sparrows. So they're, the legal system also needs to deal with these kind of sparrows, because the netizens, the internet has become increasingly important and powerful and almost inescapable, I think, for all our lives, but especially Chinese life in Chinese society. And ostriches, the last category of the last species of birds, are, what I mean basically are just ordinary people living ordinary lives. Like kind of these are the people who don't care about politics. They just want to live their lives and getting rich and make money and live a more comfortable life. So I call them ostriches. Of course, these are all just metaphors, and the reason why I use these metaphors is not just for fun. It is for fun, but also is for the sake of, because I want to use these kind of 4 species of birds as metaphors to kind of provide a different perspective to think about different aspects of Chinese law. Because when you think about the legal system, we usually think about criminal law, civil law, administrative law, kind of different areas of law, basically based on the internal classification system of the legal system. But what I want to present here is a kind of a different perspective. It's kind of more like the sociological perspective, thinking about the legal system from the users. In other words, who use the legal system or who are influenced by the legal system. I think these are the 4 species of people who actually use the legal system from different aspects, or are actually punished or influenced by the legal system from this different aspects. That's why I call them the birds trapped in this Chinese legal cage. So that's the metaphor. And of course, they're overlapping categories. Not like a hawk is not necessarily an ostrich. You can easily imagine someone who's both a hawk at work, but also ostrich in life. Or you can imagine someone who's both a crow, is an activist, but also a sparrow, a netizen online, right? So they're overlapping between the categories. They're not really kind of perfectly scientific categories, whatever that means. But I'm hoping to use them to kind of develop a different classification system and different way to think about what happened in the Chinese legal system over the past 20 years. So let me just briefly talk about each of the 4 categories, then I'll stop and yield the floor to Ji and Zhen. So first of all, I want to talk about hawks. I call them shooting hawks. And this is about the laws for combating corruption. In other words, about anti-corruption, because this is really an ongoing theme Of course, many of us know that ever since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, shortly after that, he started this massive anti-corruption campaign, right? But even before that, of course, there were anti-corruption efforts going on all the way back to the 1990s. Actually, Wang Jian and I, we just wrote a paper together, look at the judicial corruption, kind of what actually influenced judicial corruption. So it's a kind of a long-standing theme in thinking about Chinese law, but also Chinese politics. And so, as many of us know, that Xi Jinping, when he started the anti-corruption campaign, there's this slogan to fight against both tigers and flies, right? Of course, these are metaphors too. So by tigers, of course, he meant the kind of the high-level senior government officials or party officials, and the flies are just the grassroots kind of street-level bureaucrats. But the idea is that both tigers and flies can be corrupt, right? So the anti-corruption campaign should kind of eradicate all of them, right? So this is a massive campaign, and has been going on since around, I think, 2013, so almost 8 years now. And a lot of people were kind of detained or prosecuted or sentenced as part of this campaign. And you can argue about the political reasons behind that. You can say it's a sincere effort to actually clean up the government. Or you can also argue it's for a way for the leaders to fight their political enemies. I mean, I'm not going to get into that political controversy. What I want to emphasize is that because of this very large-scale anti-corruption campaign, it actually changed the character of Chinese law regarding corruption, especially criminal law and related criminal procedure law and some other related aspect of Chinese law. And why? Because as many of you know, that China has a party disciplinary system. It's called because there's in the party system, there's this commission for discipline inspection, right? The Jiwei, the so-called Jiwei in Chinese. So this party disciplinary commission, basically, it was in charge of looking for the corrupt officials and then sanction them, right, within the party system. So for a long time, there's this very well-known and highly criticized measure called 双规. 双规 is really hard to translate into English. I think if you translate literally, it means basically kind of confess in a given place at a given time, at a fixed place at a fixed time. But basically what it means is that if, for example, a party cadre official was corrupt, kind of was found to have corruption problems, then the party, the party disciplinary commission people can just take that person, kind of, that person can be disappeared into an unknown location, usually kind of it can be a hotel or kind of a other kind of facility, kind of built for the sake of party disciplinary system, and then can be confined there for weeks or even months, and then being interrogated under the party, within the party system internally, and then only after kind of that corrupt official confessed, his or her behavior, usually his behavior, and then after the party disciplinary process was completed, that person will be transferred into the criminal justice system. And in the procuracy, the 检察院 of the Chinese criminal justice system, there's a special bureau called the Anti-Corruption Bureau. And so that's the bureau basically in charge of prosecuting these corrupt officials in the criminal justice system. But the Anti-Corruption Bureau only kind of started to work on the case after the party disciplinary process was completed. So in other words, there are two parallel systems for anti-corruption, one in the party system about the party disciplinary system, one in the criminal justice system is the Anti-Corruption Bureau. And these two agencies, of course, often work together, but there's a division of labor. So the party process happens first. And then only after, all the confessions are made, all the things were done, these things were transferred into the procuracy. And then usually the corrupt officials will need to kind of do the legal process again, confess again to the prosecutors in the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and then prosecute, prosecution, trial, and then sentence, to basically follow the criminal procedure law. So that was the system that has been in place for quite a long time, I think ever since the 1990s. And of course, Li Ling from at the University of Vienna wrote extensively about this, some really wonderful work about this topic. But then what happened is that, of course, the Shuangui has been, as I said, heavily criticized, both in China and especially outside China, because the person under Shuangui had basically almost no legal right, because nobody knows where this person is. There's no legal representation, not even like a meeting with lawyer. I mean, even the family members didn't know where that person was. I mean, that person can disappear for weeks or months, without any kind of legal remedy. And of course, that kind of whole system used to be completely outside of the legal sphere. And of course, that doesn't mean that the party disciplinary system was unregulated. Of course, there are a lot of internal party rules. Li Ling's research actually showed this quite clearly, that a lot of internal party disciplinary rules were developed, became actually quite sophisticated to regulate the party disciplinary system. But if you look at the formal law, like the Chinese criminal law, Chinese criminal procedure law, you didn't see that. It was not written in the law. It's kind of outside of the legal sphere. So that generated a lot of criticism, obviously. So I think in the past 10 years, actually it started even before the anti-corruption campaign. I think there has been a notable effort to legalize the Shuangui system, legalize the party disciplinary system. And it started, of course, with the revision of the criminal procedure law in 2012. So during that revision, there was this new article called it's Article 73, I think, called residential surveillance at a designated location. So 指定监视居住 in Article 73. So what that article did is that basically it legalized this kind of detention under the party system, because there are three kind of cases you can go into that system. Of course, terrorism cases, state security cases, and also anti-corruption cases. Serious bribery or embezzlement cases, you can use that procedure. But that, of course, provide a legal basis, for the party to just disappear someone into a designated location to have residential surveillance, right? So that was the first step to legalize the party's disciplinary system. And there are many steps in between. For the sake of time, I'll skip. But the second point, of course, is the establishment of the National Supervision Commission in 2018, 3 years ago, the 国家监察委. So that's a kind of a huge institutional effort. We basically integrated the party disciplinary system and the anti-corruption bureau in the bureaucracy into one commission, kind of at the same level as the Supreme Court, as the Supreme People's Bureaucracy and the Ministry of Public Security. So now the party disciplinary system become the national supervision system, and that under that system, of course, it also expanded the scope of the disciplinary process from just party cadres, party members, to everybody. Kind of, even if you're not a Communist Party member, but you hold an official position, and then there are corruption problems, that can be investigated and prosecuted under the National Supervision Commission. So you can see what happened. Just to summarize here is that exactly what I call the party inscription process going on. So it used to be that party disciplinary system was outside of the legal system, was hiding behind the veil of criminal law, criminal procedure law, and now it was built into these laws. And now there's special institutions, legalized institutions like the National Supervision Commission, established to actually legalize that process. Now the party disciplinary system inscribed itself into the Chinese legal system. So that's just one example. So for the sake of time, I'll just move on to the other three categories. We can come back to this topic. I mean, these are broad topics, so many of these topics, can generate probably a seminar in itself. But the second categories I want to talk about is the crows, the killing crows. This is about the laws for political stability. Again, you can see my classification of the laws is not really criminal law, civil law, commercial law, but really, what is the law aiming at, and who are the people that kind of under the influence of these laws. So the laws for political stability are basically laws to control the activists, like activist lawyers or feminists. There are many examples. There the so-called Weiquan lawyers or human rights lawyers, the feminist activists, the labor activists, environmental activists. There are a lot of activists that used to be very active in Chinese society, especially I think during the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao era. In the Hu Wen era, that was the time, and now you look back, During that time, a lot of people didn't feel that way. I didn't feel that way. But now you look back, I think that was actually a very good time for civil society in China. So although, I mean, civil society has always been kind of under a lot of constraints in the Chinese context, but during the Huwen period in the mid 2000s, for example, you see actually a lot of these activists, no matter you fight for labor rights, women's rights, human rights, or other things, there are kind of a fair amount of room for them to mobilize and also to have collective action. And that, of course, started to change, I think, in the past 10 years. Especially, I think, I mean, there are different reasons for the change. One important reason, I think, has something to do with the rise of social media. So with the rise of Weibo, especially, and later on, of course, WeChat, what happened is that these activists, started to mobilize in much bigger scale because they can connect with each other, networking with each other through the social media. So you start to see these massive scale, large scale mobilization. For example, there's a group of the so-called 死磕律师, die-hard lawyers. Sometimes 50 lawyers or 100 lawyers fly to the same place and mobilize for the same case. That kind of thing started to happen in the I think around 2012, 2013, 2014, those a few years. At the same time, for example, if you look at feminist movement, there are also the so-called 女权行动派, the action-oriented feminists. They also use similar techniques. They mobilize online. Many of them are fairly young. They were like college students at the time. They would actually do a lot of performance arts and a lot of things, use both on the street and also using the internet as a cyberspace to magnify their movement. So of course, these collective actions started to make the government very very concerned and worried. And so that was one thing that's happening. But on the other hand, I think after Xi Jinping came to power, also I think the room for civil society was gradually shrinking. The government started to control civil society a lot more closely. So of course, a big part of this is to make sure that these activists are not making trouble for the government. So I think so what happened is that, of course, I mean, as this slide shows, I think the turning point, the important year, the turning point is 2015, when in the same year there was a Feminist 5 detention. Then there was like a 709 crackdown on lawyers, and I think in December there was a crackdown on labor activists, right? So that was kind of a big crackdown. So a lot of attention, I think, in the literature on Chinese law, focusing on these activists and activism, focusing on kind of the detention and what happened to these activists. But what I want to emphasize here is actually another aspect of this, which is in the past 10 years, what you see is that the party state actually established a lot of new mechanisms to control these groups. I'll give you a couple of examples for the sake of time. The first is that it greatly strengthened the associational control over these activists. Because by associational control, I mean those, for example, the bar associations or the women's federation or the trade unions, the 律协、妇联, 工会, all these kind of associations. I mean, for any of us who are familiar with the Chinese context, these associations are now voluntary associations. They're like almost kind of arms, extended arms of the Chinese government, right? So, but they used to be quite weak, I think, these associations. They don't really actively control their, these activists. Like I've been studying Chinese lawyers for more than 15 years now. I see this change shift very clearly. You see, the bar association used to be a lot less proactive in kind of repressing and suppressing these lawyer activists, but in the past 10 years they become more and more active. And you see the same parallel process in terms of the trade union, the women's federation. They're using different techniques, but I think the general association control over these civil rights, civil society groups or professions started to increase in the past decade. And in terms of both the institutional power of these professional associations or the kind of the trade unions or whatever, but also I think the way they actually sanction their members. Just using lawyers as an example. 10 years ago, there were like a human rights lawyer who were disbarred. That happens maybe occasionally, once or twice every year. And if you look at the past 5 years, disbarring lawyers become more and more common. kind of, even in the past year, I can think of at least more than 5 or even 10 different examples of lawyers being disbarred or being suspended their license for extended period of time. So that kind of thing started to happen. I think a lot more often than before. And also kind of, I already mentioned their party committees, party cells kind of started embedded in these different occupational groups. So that's one aspect of it. But of course, there are also kind of things, changes in the law itself, in the criminal law, in the criminal procedure law, kind of all these kind of new rules about kind of controlling mobilization, kind of, for the sake of maintaining some stability, the so-called Weiwen effort, that, and of course that also has something to do with the rise of the security state and all these things, and so make all these changes actually make these the lives of these so-called pros, kind of these activists who are kind of try to challenge the party state increasingly difficult. So as a result, now you see, I mean, of course, there are still a lot of activists in China. They're living very difficult lives now, but more and more you start to see these kind of professionals or civil society groups starting to move toward the state, become kind of the so-called state-adjacent professionals, or the so-called red lawyers, the red professionals, like again, Richard Stern and Lawrence Liu at Berkeley recently published a couple of really good papers about, for example, now you see the rise of the so-called red lawyers or state-adjacent lawyers in China. 10 years, not even 10 years ago, I think 7 or 8 years ago, the lawyers who got a lot of attention are the so-called 死磕律师, the die-hard lawyers, and some of the lawyers on the slide. But now I think the lawyers getting a lot of attention are the lawyers who are more loyal to the party. So you can see so there's a part of the Chinese law also kind of shifting toward kind of killing these activists, make sure that they're not making trouble. And the third aspect of this is about sparrows, what I call sparrows, laws for internet control. So this is a very familiar topic. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but basically the idea is that because I mean it's a lot easier, I think, for the Chinese government to control both the bureaucrats and the activists because they're more visible. But controlling the internet is actually a lot more challenging. And it's not just like building a great firewall, which is very successful. One of the cartoons on this slide is really about the great firewall. But I think a lot of attention, especially from outside China, focus on when look at the China's internet control, focus on the so-called great firewall, basically preventing information from outside from entering China. But I think the equally important, if not more important aspect, is how actually the government is using the legal system to control the internal activities within China in terms of internet. So that, I think that's kind of what I want to emphasize in this paper, because if you look at again the evolution of the Chinese internet, even if we don't consider the Great Firewall, we're just looking at within the wall, then you see kind of a lot more surveillance and control over time, and many of them has something to do with the legal change. For example, just again for the sake of time, just a couple of quick examples. The passage of the 2016 cybersecurity law, which is a huge deal, I think changed the nature of the internet in China. I think for many of us who don't study the cybersecurity issues or these kind of things, we didn't even pay much attention to the law when it came out, but it turned out to be quite significant. I mean, there are many aspects of the cybersecurity law. I'm not an expert on cybersecurity, but one important thing, I think Article 24 of the cybersecurity law establishes the so-called 网络实名制, kind of a real name, network real name system. Basically, from that point, on, basically for the past 5 years at least, if you're an internet user in China, you have to register with your real name, real ID number, and all these things. So if anything happens on the internet, they can track you down. And of course, you can argue that many similar systems also exist, increasingly exist in other places. But in China, it's kind of pushed to the kind of probably, I mean, it become a legal requirement, right? So that's a cybersecurity law was a kind of important turning point for that. And another very quick example is that, of course, I think in one of the amendments of the Chinese criminal law, it added this article. For example, if you spread rumor on the internet, and it was reposted for more than 500 times, or it was read by more than I think 5,000 times, and then it can be a crime if this rumor actually causes some consequences. You can be sentenced to up for 3 years in prison. I mean, think about it. It's actually quite these kind of rules are quite harsh. I'm not really too sure how much it was well implemented in practice, but if you think about it, I mean, I have a Weibo account. I have about 100,000 followers or something, and it's very easy. If you post something, it was reposted 500 times. You have some followers. Even you don't have a lot of followers, it was posted by someone who has a lot of followers. You can easily get to that. So that's there's a criminal consequences, that potential criminal consequences involved. So all these kind of internet control methods, you can see, like was built into the Chinese legal system, the cybersecurity law, the criminal law, and I don't have time to go into other aspects of this, but it basically established this kind of surveillance, almost legal surveillance system to control the speech, of course, and activities on the internet. But that, of course, is a kind of highly efficient tool to kind of constrain activism and constrain many other things. But I also want to emphasize that's also the place, I think, you see the legal system is not enough. I mean, the legal system is not enough. You actually need more kind of, it was combined with a lot of other things. For example, you can't just rely on the cybersecurity law or the criminal law to sanction the internet. So as we all know, the Chinese state actually employs an army of volunteers or other kind of state officials to actually help them monitor the internet, and also spread the so-called positive energy, 正能量, over the internet. So that's the place you see the legal measures are not enough. You actually need kind of both the legal measures and also the kind of the normative and the mass, almost like mass mobilization measures on the internet to control this the speech. So I think that's kind of so this, as you can see, I'm moving from the hawks to the crows to the internet. You can see the limit of the legal system, the limit of the internal differentiation, the party inscription become more and more obvious. So the last point I want to talk about is, of course, the ostriches, feeding ostriches. This is about the laws for everyday life. And this is under this category, this is like the vast territories of civil and commercial law, kind of almost like, the property law, the tort law, the marriage law, all these things kind of, those non-political things. And I call this feeding ostriches because, I mean, if you think about, like, for the vast majority of Chinese citizens, ordinary people, they're not that political, or they don't, kind of actively engage in politics, either because they don't have the opportunity or they just don't care. I mean, they spend most of their times actually just trying to make money, improve their lives, and buy houses, and live a better life, basically. So for that part of Chinese law, I think it's actually the dynamics is really not the same. It's quite different, I think, from some of the more political aspects I just talked about. So again, for the sake of time, I'll just give a couple of examples. So I think this is the kind of the laws for everyday life is the aspect of Chinese law that's you see the highest degree of internal differentiation. Like obvious example is that just last year, China finally finished its unified civil code, the so-called 民法典, kind of the civil. Now there's a civil code of more than 1,000 articles, right? Unified all the contract law, tort law, all these things together. As I said, if you think about it, it's quite remarkable. 20 years ago, when Lobman was writing his book, when I was in law school, all these things were not even there. Half of the laws now in the unified civil code was not even there. And now there's unified code governing all these civil different aspects of civil law. Right. So that, of course, you see this high degree of internal differentiation. But on the other hand, I think this is also precisely because the civil aspect, civil and commercial aspect of law is not that political. You don't see much party inscription into these aspects. It's harder for the party to actually establish its control over all these kind of ordinary life. And this is not just in China. I think this is a more universal thing, because I mean, I still remember many years ago when I was still teaching at Wisconsin, one of my colleagues, Kathy Hadley, who's one of the greatest scholars on Russian law in the U.S., And we were chatting, and she said, if you look at what happened in Russia during the Soviet Union over 70 years, of course there are all kinds of political campaigns, upheavals, all these things. But if you go to a lower court, a grassroots court, look at how justice was actually administered in lower court, it actually didn't change that much over 70 years. And you actually see the same thing, in terms of civil commercial aspect. Of course, these laws changed and people's lives were improving very fast. Tremendous economic growth and a lot of wealth created in China over the 20 years. But you don't see really that was heavily influenced by the party or the party inscription. So I think that's one aspect. So it's a lot harder for the party to penetrate, ordinary social life. But of course, that doesn't mean that, now you have a unified civil code. The civil law is actually wonderful, right? There are still a lot of problems, of course, in enforcing these laws, and a lot of social problems that the law couldn't really respond very well. For example, the food safety problem, kind of the cartoon on the right, has always been an issue. I mean, there are all kinds of food security law, all kinds of law made in China. They were really still kind of fighting the problem. And another aspect of it is patent and trademarks, intellectual property law. You can see used to be patent and trademark law. Still, Andy Murtha wrote this great book called The Politics of Piracy, 16 years ago in 2005. At that time, when you talk about patent law in China, you're mostly talking about like a Chinese counterfeit, like a violation of patent or copyright or trademark of foreign brands. But now patent and trademark issues are domestic issues, and there are a lot of very complex issues involving patent and trademark. And those are the places precisely you see the highest degree of internal differentiation, but you see the lowest degree of party inscription. And so, I mean, but of course, above all that, the big question is like, what will happen to these ostriches? So in other words, are the ordinary Chinese citizens, they're just going to content with their lives, not care about politics, just, keep enriching their lives, and without actually changing the aspect of the, kind of the more political aspect I talk about, or are they going to, someday, turn into sparrows or crows or even hawks, right? So I think that's where I think I want to make a point. Then I will, I think, conclude, which is, I think there has always been a theory of the dual state. I think more recently, Ava Peels, our friends at King's College, argue that what's happening in Chinese law is kind of the dual state model. Kind of there's a state for a different state for ordinary matters, like the civil commercial law, and there's a prerogative state for the kind of the politically sensitive matters or other matters. And these two are kind of parallel parts of the legal system or the political system. They don't really go together hand in hand. I'm actually a little skeptical about that assessment, because I do think goes back to, I think, the point I think Tai-Su and Tom Ginsburg made in their paper China's Turn Towards Law. I think that when one aspect, especially a big chunk of the legal system and the court, become highly rational and highly differentiated and internally complex and functional, it will spill over to other aspects of Chinese law. For example, you can't expect Chinese judges be like highly sophisticated professional judges in intellectual property cases, but when they deal with criminal cases, it becomes someone completely different, right? So I think that's where I think any legal system, their internal coherence that kind of goes beyond kind of the fragmented fields. So I think so I'm actually not that pessimistic that I think the internal differentiation in the kind of laws for everyday life, I think more or less will spill over to the more political side of things. All right, I think I'm probably already over time, so let me quickly conclude. So basically what I'm saying in this article is that, there's this Weberian iron cage effect of legal modernization happened in China. I think you can clearly see that in the past 20 years. As the legal system becoming more and more sophisticated, complex, and internally coherent, it also become more and more like a cage, kind of, because fundamentally, the law was an instrument, I think, for the party state. So there's a highly instrumental aspect of the legal system, kind of on top of its internal coherence and rationality. And that, of course, if we go back to Lobman's book to reflect what happened since then, is I think when Lobman was writing that book, was using the metaphor of bird in a cage, by referring Chinese law as a bird. I think there was part of this hope, or you might say even an illusion, of using law as a driving force for social change. Kind of, law was kind of almost like becoming a kind of a driver for social change. I mean, that was, you see that over generations by law and development scholars, they try to use law as a force for social change, over generations across the world. But if you look empirically, I think for most places, in most of the time, law is not a driving force for social change. Law is often used as an instrument by the politicians, by the government, and by the political parties to actually maintain the status quo and maintain stability. Right. So I think that idea about law as a driving force for social change, I think after 20 years, I think we can see this much more clearly in the Chinese case. Is really not a very tenable argument. And I want to end this talk with a question, of course, because I mean, if you guys, I hope what I said was convincing enough to show that you can think of Chinese law as a legal cage now. And if the cage is very hard to break, but will there ever be a latch door for all those birds I talk about trapped in this cage to go free someday? I think that's the question I want to leave here. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I look forward to Juan and Ji's comments.
All right, thank you, Sida. So we're going to go straight to the commentators. Wang Juan, please feel free to go first, I guess.
Okay, thank you for having me here. It's always a pleasure to read Sida's work. I really appreciate overall reflection of what's happening in China, and it really got me thinking of what's happening. What are some broad changes right now? I love the metaphor of the birds. And I quite agree with the two stages and two changes that you identified, the internal institutionalization and then the party inscription. Now, so basically the party, especially the party inscription part, right? So the party reasserted its control through formal structural penetration to various organizations, private business, bar association, all that. And then they cover this kind of, not really cover because it's actually explicit now, but within the framework of law, right? In the name of law. And at the same time, this change is accompanied by strengthening ideological education. Okay, so my thinking as reading your reflection can be divided by three broad questions. One is that, and I wonder what you think about them. One is that why formality, right? So in other words, the party before the current administration, the law, as you said, the law was already subordinate. Certainly, there was various arbitrary use of law, and the party wanted to assert more control. But why using formal control? Why the formality? As you said, formality matters, and you have more control over personnel activities, but also insert control through formality. Why not, behind the doors and insert control? I'm curious. This new form of control is formal, explicit, both substantive and discursive. Right, so I'm curious how you think about this. Why formality? Second one is in terms of the relationship between reducing restlessness versus reducing arbitrariness. Right, so you end this reflection with a very with a pessimistic note. I quote for most, and you quote Cheeseman a little bit, but your reflection was, for most of human history, the fate of law has always been a cage, especially when it is situated under an authoritarian state that prioritizes instrumentality over proceduralism and focuses on reducing restlessness rather than arbitrariness. Right? I wonder if this formality, so this connected to the first thought and question, whether this formality actually reduces arbitrariness as well, or perhaps it's not necessary. It doesn't eliminate it for sure, rather it wanted to keep some of the arbitrariness, but rather centralize it. So in other words, in contrast to Lobman's early observation that there was a fragmented authority, and now authorities are more consolidated and centralized to the party and perhaps national elites. So do you observe this change? Can we say that in the past the points of interference in law are too fragmented, can be by organizations, can be by individuals. Right now it's rather limited to a smaller group of people. So that's the thinking, reducing restlessness versus reducing arbitrariness. Finally is the concept of trap, right? So, and I agree with the due state. They're not isolated different areas. There for sure there's a spillover effect. And so when we think about the due state and when we think about ostrich, it's like, is it a story of frogs in the water? But given that we're thinking from the perspective of the birds, so thinking from the perspective of the ostriches, is it that they are just indifferent? I see some, perhaps law here could serve as both stick, as weapon. What my colleague, Maria Popova, you also know, she calls weaponization law, but also it could be a carrot, because through law, there's a signal of responsiveness from the regime, as you identified the food safety, right? And on March 1st, the new criminal amendment is going to be, in fact, there's some, other than some more political articles, there's also response towards public outcry in terms of sexual assault, and in terms of loan sharks, and in terms of those 我不是药神 the decriminalizing those who import medicine from abroad, which are not yet approved by domestic authorities, right? So these laws, these kind of articles showcase the responsiveness of the state where the ostriches were like. So here ostriches are not like passively indifferent, putting their heads in the sand. Rather, it seems like they could have a positive feeling towards the use of law. So these are just three. Reading your reflection, I start to reflect on what's happening. These are the three main things. I'm curious what you think about, how you think about this particular type of change that's happening in China. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. So Li Qi, you should go next, and then Sida, you can take however long you want to respond.
Right. So thanks, Sida, for sharing with us this work. It's a very interesting and thought-provoking review essay, and I think I generally agree with your reflections on the development of the Chinese legal system in the past 2 decades. And I'm just going to throw out some thoughts and comments, because in line with what you're doing in this essay, just want to inspire a conversation, right? The exchange of thoughts on this general and broad topic, but important topic. So I will start with the title, right? The social transformation of the Chinese legal system. A side note, why thanks for sharing with us, the background of this essay. When I first read it, I thought you were talking about the Game of Thrones, right? The crows, the sparrows, and birds. So I thought that's what started you on this path. But it turns out that the University of Michigan conference was the triggering point.
I did watch the Game of Thrones when I was writing this too, so I don't know whether that's
maybe you want to throw that into the essay so that it will be more popular among the American audience. Yeah, so So I will start with the title, the social transformation of the Chinese legal system. So to me, when I think about social transformation, I will have more like a concept of bottom-up changes that occurs to the Chinese legal system. But in your interpretation of what happened, there's a significant state factor, right? The party inscription. So I think I would just want a little bit more clarification on that. I think by the end of the article, I think my impression is that you're really talking about both social and political transformation of the Chinese legal system, and to a great extent, I think the political aspect is more important and it plays a more central role in this process. So I guess either you incorporate the political part into the social transformation a little better, or you just change the title from the current one to social and political transformation of the Chinese legal system in the past 2 decades. And then, and also my, well, after I read it twice, just to make sure that I understand the themes and the main arguments. So to a certain extent, I understand your argument as being, well, this is really rule by law, right? The Chinese the Communist Party is ruled by law, and what happened was that before the rule by law was not very effective, and after the institutionalization, right, the institutional building in the first decade, right. The legal weapon became more effective. So now the party is more willing to apply this legal tool in the governance of China. So is that I guess that can be viewed as the alternative interpretation of the changes in the past 2 decades, and you can break that into 2 dimensions, right? The desire to use law to govern China and the capacity to do it, right? And from 1999 to 2000, early 2010, right? They built the weapon and made it more effective. And once it became effective, it started to apply it to the governance of China. So that's another way to see it. And it just, I don't know if you find that to be a workable alternative, right? And another question is why these 4 groups, right? You mentioned in the essay that this is not a comprehensive overview of all, social groups that mediate state social relationships. But I want to really emphasize the last 2 groups, given the penetration of internet and the wide usage of smartphones in China. Don't we have, aren't all Chinese basically netizens these days, right? In other words, you have only 3 groups, right? The crows, the hawks, and the general populace who use internet or who have access to the internet on daily basis. So and simply the law just regulate their behaviors in 2 ways. One is online, one is offline, right? So that's if there's some distinction, right, between the sparrows and ostriches, you probably want to highlight the distinctions, because otherwise they seem to be the same group. We are really just talking about 2 aspects, right? Two aspects of the same group. And also there are other important groups in China that I will see how they act in this legal changes in China. The business elites, for example, right? The Jack Ma is a very good example of what happens to them, right? And And also there's a huge overlap between the Tijine, the state, the regime, and Tijy, right? Those who are not closely affiliated with the state. But there's huge overlap, right? On the boundary, how do they tackle the legal changes in China, right? So for example, people with good close 关系, right? Good 关系 with government officials, right? They sometimes they are in the TC, right? They benefit from the a strengthened regime, and sometimes their interest come into conflict with a stronger party control. So how do they navigate the Chinese legal system? That's something I'm curious to learn more. And but I guess at this stage, the part you can't really substantially revise the article. But I guess that's just a topic for future exploration. And also another main point I want to make is that you basically look at the Chinese legal system in isolation from the outside world. I think especially in the past 2 decades, right? I think there's enormous interactions between China, between stakeholders in China and the outside world. I doubt. I think it will be a lot richer if you bring that aspect into consideration, right? The legal transplants, the exchange of information, exchange of knowledge. Even though there's this great firewall, but compared to decades ago, millions of Chinese now travel abroad, right, work abroad, and they have first-hand access to information abroad. So how does that affect their understanding and the interaction with the Chinese legal system? I think that's an important topic that's missing in this essay, but also I think it will be enriching if you bring that into consideration. Well, lastly, that I don't want to take up too much time. It's just this question about theoretical framework, right? So my impression is that you are more eclectic when it comes to a theoretical framework. I don't think you subscribe to any, even though you say this is a social legal approach to Chinese law legal system, but I sense that you really borrow from different theoretical branches. So, but I would. This is really a question not only for you, but also for me and or others who are interested in the Chinese legal system. So, are the existing legal theoretical frameworks, social science theories, are they adequate in explaining the Chinese legal changes, or not, right? Do we need to try to formulate a new theoretical framework to better understand the Chinese legal changes? In my sense that they are not adequate, but where should we go from here, right? What's the future theoretical framework will look like? I'm sure it cannot be addressed in this essay, but that's something I guess we'll all ponder, right, in the future. And lastly, the metaphor, right? To me, I think this is just for me, right? I would like to think about Chinese law as the Russian nesting dolls, right? One small wooden doll embedded in a bigger one, and then another bigger one. So decades ago, the Chinese legal system was the smallest doll in the set, and now it becomes larger, but still is embedded in the social and political context in China. So that's all. But overall, I really enjoyed this piece, and looking forward to your future work on this topic.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. And Sida, floor is yours again. And after that, we're going to go to the audience.
Yeah, so I really want to save more time for the audience, so I'll try to kind of just briefly respond to some of the questions, not all the questions Juan and Lee raised, hopefully within 5 minutes, so we will have close to an hour for the discussion. So on the question, why formality? Because I do think, and this is maybe come from the fact that I'm a social legal scholar, so I think in the law and society scholarship, I think not enough attention has been paid to formality. I think social legal scholars tend to look at the substantive issues like justice, like inequality, like power, all these things. But I think, here I'm taking this perspective to try to think about the legal system. Just look at the legal system itself. What actually happened to the legal system? Not just, oh, look at how the legal system, interact with different aspects of society and then change other things. So I think that's kind of the where the formality thing come from. I'll save that restless versus arbitrariness discussion for later, because I think that's a much more profound theoretical discussion. Go back to the Cheeseman's article about the rule of law. But I do want to kind of respond to John's point about the kind of the, like, are these birds trapped in the law, especially the kind of ostriches category? Because maybe in my presentation I gave, maybe even the paper I gave the impression that order citizens are just indifferent. I mean, they're but I don't actually think that's the case. Especially, I think if you look at, especially now, I think after the more sensitive political issues have been kind of more controlled, because you can probably talk about like human rights or labor rights a lot more actively 10 years ago than now. But I think there are other things like consumer rights, like the right of the elderly, for example, the disabled, all these kind of other things, kind of more related to the kind of less political aspect, but kind of more related to the ordinary lives of ordinary people. I think that's really, those are places you still see a lot of mobilization. And I think that, that's kind of go back to the point I said, why it's not, I don't believe in the doomsday stories, because I think the mobilization around these non-political issues will eventually get political and eventually spill over to other aspect of things, kind of the more political aspect of the legal system. So I don't really think you can separate the kind of the laws for everyday life and to the others. And to G's point, most of G's points are very well taken. I think there are, obviously I ignore the business elites, I ignore the international aspects. I actually thought about some of those, when I was designing this classification, but I think I left them out. It's just simply because it's just too complicated. I'm already covering a vast territory, as you can see. Like, this is like the broadest paper I've ever written. Like kind of everything under the sun is in the paper. But so I just, it's just too much. But absolutely, if you do if you do not take the Chinese legal system as an isolated autonomous system, but actually see it as part of this more kind of global system of law, kind of or legal modernization or globalization happening around the world, I think look at the diffusion, look at the interaction. I think there are a lot of stuff to be said, and maybe there will be a new species of birds emerging there. I'm pretty sure, or maybe airplanes, not just birds. And also the business elites, of course, is a good point. But I think that I really like Ji's point about kind of, you look at the 20-year history, and if you look at what exactly is the story, right? I gave a story, but I think Ji's version is actually a really good one, which is, I think Wang Juan and I actually, we wrote a paper a couple of years ago called Ordering Power Under the Party, kind of looking at kind of how, kind of what we call a relational approach to one policy in China. I think one point we made there is that if you look at how the Chinese government think about governance, not just law, but governance more generally, I think law has always been just one of many tools in the toolbox, in the toolkit, right? So like, for example, even in the 90s, when Lobman was writing about this, I mean, there's Jiang Zemin had this slogan about 依法治国 versus 以德治国. Right. So the law and the morality has always kind of, the normative aspect and the legal aspect has always go together. So law has always been like one of the many toolkits. And I think T's point is a really interesting and important one, which is maybe it's just because the legal tool was not that sophisticated in the 90s, right? So there was not, I mean, now it become a lot more sophisticated. So it's actually quite more effective, efficient, right? So that actually, elevated the party inscription, why the party want to inscribe itself, precisely because this tool is very powerful. It's important to put your name on it, right? So I think that's what part of it was happening. But on the other hand, I think the flip side of that is that, but on the other hand, if you think about it, there is this internal logic about internal, I mean, in other words, I guess what I want to say is that internal differentiation and party inscription, there's actually internal tension between them, because the more kind of rational and complex the legal system becomes, the more there's an internal logic. What T also asked about theoretical perspective. I mean, like Nicholas Luhmann and some European theorists would call them the self-referential system. So there's an internal logic to the legal system. Even the kind of the party inscription couldn't really necessarily penetrate. Now it's kind of penetrates them quite easily. But if you look at the judicial reforms and all these things, I think eventually there will be some logic of the internal rationality could be actually undermining the party dominance over the legal system. But we don't see that yet, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. So there are some theoretical issues that I think quite interesting. We can extend the discussion, but I really want to stop here and yield the floor to the audience.
Great, thank you, Sida. So again, we're going to do our usual thing. You can ask a question by raising your hand. You can ask a question by typing it into the chat. Chen Li and his students are going to keep an eye on questions from the Xie side. But so starting from this point onwards, if you have a question, please indicate your interest in one of those manners. I'm going to do the conventional thing and kind of ask the first question, which is, so there's tons of interesting things within this paper to talk about. Like what I suppose I want to focus on right now is this question of the internal logic that you talk about. So the internal logic thing comes down to basically two core questions. First of all, like how much internal, I suppose, like intellectual and behavioral coherency do you observe in the legal profession? I certainly would, you guys obviously know what I think, like I tend to believe there's more and more of that kind of internal cohesion. There's a stronger professional identity that both some combination of the courts, the legal academy, and lawyers are interested in pushing. They have their own agenda, and so on and so forth. That part is perhaps like the easier thing to observe. Now, the second question basically goes down to this final question of like, you left off your comments just now with this question of whether the party would be able to kind of control the legal system as thoroughly as it seems to be able to do at this point. And fundamentally, that's a question of like, in some ways, like informational and expertise asymmetry between legal actors and, I suppose, like whoever you want to call the party, right? Although increasingly, one of the things about the party is that increasingly it makes more sense to speak of like the general party membership in somewhat separate terms as kind of like the central leadership, because it's almost in some ways you could almost say like, over the past 5 years, the central leadership's expressed more distrust of like lower echelons of the party than it has at any point in the previous 40 years, right? Like it's tried to centralize, it's tried to control how they operate, it's tried to basically like take away most sources of personal discretion that used to be available to lower level party branches. But assuming that, like, nonetheless, and I think we're all in kind of agreement that the party leadership wants to maintain somewhat absolute control of pretty much every lever of power. And when I'm pretty sure that if you talk to people in the Politburo, they think like the legal system ought to be like this on-off switch that's held in the hands of the party leadership, right? So it can be adjusted and flipped on and off based on whatever the political directives coming out of the party leadership actually are. Whereas, like in the minds of you and me and perhaps lots of other commentators, we're kind of holding out this perhaps naive hope that there's a snowball effect that, like, once you grant some kind of authority to the formalistic legal regime, it's hard to take that back, both because of perhaps like bottom-up perceptions like saying that we're going to move down this path towards legality. It's kind of like a one-way street in terms of like popular perception. Once you go down that road, it's hard to take it back. But the second, more internalist mechanism seems to be that like once you open up once you begin to empower the legal system against certain kinds of politics, the fact that the legal structure tends to self-reproduce in terms of sophistication means that like further down the road you have no choice but to kind of turn to them again and give them more perhaps not necessarily more explicit, like more formal discretion, but like it's going to be hard to fully keep them under control, because at some point, like the information asymmetry and the expertise asymmetry is going to get so large that you just won't be able to know exactly what it is that they're doing at every single point. So that seems to be what you were hinting at in some ways. And at the same time, it seems to be kind of like a somewhat conventional narrative of like long marches towards the rule of law or snowballing legality. One thing that I was thinking of while you were kind of like talking and giving your presentation initially was, if you merge the party into the legal system, some of that calculation begins to change, right? So if we insist on thinking of the party as this kind of like predominantly political entity that fundamentally operates according to political directives and therefore lacks the formalistic legal sophistication of the legal profession, well, that's one thing, right? But the second, the other way to think about the party is, if you begin to merge the party and law in this like more systemic fashion, the party's legal sophistication could actually begin to increase quite a bit, right? And at that point, you could say, okay, if that's the case, then sure, that just means the party is kind of like voluntarily formalizing itself, and the movements of the party is going to, it's going to become more predictable and more legalistic and more institutionalized over the next couple of years. It's like changing the party from the inside out. But of course, like the other way to think about this is that at the same time, it also kind of like, even if that kind of happens, it also removes a lot of the information and kind of like expertise asymmetry between the legal profession and kind of like the party apparatus, which in the end tends to have like this dual-ended impact on both the party and the legal system, which basically means that you do have formalization, you do have institutionalization, but it's not formalization and institutionalization of the kind that you would kind of imagine in like this Western rule of law thing. It's still highly formalized and it becomes predictable, becomes institutionalized. The party becomes more like a machine. Everything becomes more in accordance to like Weberian notions of legality. But at the same time, the political directives toward like the overall political direction that kind of legal expertise is targeted towards becomes very much aligned with the overall political interests of the party, right? So I guess what I'm basically trying to get at is, like how much, if you were weighing all these possibilities, what do you think is the most likely outcome of this process? Is it that like there's a legal profession, there's the party tries to exert control. It may or may not succeed in doing that because of the asymmetry and the information gap and the expertise gap. Or do you think it's more likely that these two things will be successfully melded into like one unified entity? In which case the internal logic of the law contains a large dose of essentially, like the political interest of the party itself, right? So at some point, it's no longer going to make sense to speak of these two things as like opposite ideal types. Instead, they're one single unified ideal type, which is fully legalistic and like fully professionalized in some ways, and institutionalized. But at the same time, it's also fully in accordance to the core kind of like self-survival interests of the party. So essentially, the question is like how much, like how large do you think the potential is of true systemic merger between these two things?
Both are great questions. I think the first one is easier to answer. The second one is a lot more difficult. So let me answer the first one first. Of course, if we look at the past 20 years, we do observe the rise of legal expertise, certainly, and the kind of the more solidarity and also more kind of the professionalization of the legal profession, right? That by the legal profession, I don't mean just lawyers, but also judges, prosecutors, and also, like this, just simply, based on their education, it's common education and many other aspects. But I think there's one important thing to keep in mind, which is the legal profession in China, like the legal profession in many other places, is like highly stratified. In China, it's probably even more stratified than many other places. So at least up to this point, I don't really observe I don't even want to use the word unified or kind of a more consensus-based professional ethics or professional norms emerging in the Chinese legal profession. There are some recent cases I can talk about, like, for example, like some very high-profile criminal defense lawyer were actually sanctioned because they posted a video of a case file online, and then there was like all this kind of internal discussion in the legal profession, like whether that's ethical or not ethical. There are a lot of controversies. There's really I don't see that. So professional ethics, I think, is still quite weak within the Chinese legal profession. And more importantly, if you look talk to the, say, some of my Beida Law School friends who are corporate lawyers working in the kind of the Beijing, Shanghai, these nice corporate offices, and if you talk to lawyers who are actually serving individuals in ordinary litigation, I think that they're very different people, very different, have different political orientation, different ways to relate to the state. So I don't really see that, as, if you take the legal profession as a whole, I don't see they're certainly more professional, more educated, more professional, oriented, but I don't really see the internal coherence in the legal profession. I guess that's what I want to say on the first point. So, the second one is a really interesting but difficult question. So I guess what I'm arguing in the paper is that right now, what we observed, what happened in the past 10, 20 years, and what's happening now is that the legal system become a lot more formal, rational, and complex, and sophisticated, and internally coherent. There's internal logic emerging or even established in the legal system. On the other hand, what I didn't talk about, I'm glad Taisu, you mentioned it. I think Ji also mentioned it, which is the party itself also become a lot more rational, in the sense there are internal party rules. There are lots of discussions actually in recent years about the so-called 党内法规, right? Internal party rules, and become a lot more rational. So if you think about the party, you can think of the party, I think, I don't know if Li Ling is here. If Li Ling is here, she can speak on this much more, with much more authority than I do. But I think you can think of the party as a bunch of leaders, like the Politburo Standing Committee leaders, or you can think of the party as a bureaucracy. Think about the Leviathan. Are you talking about the head of the Leviathan, or are you talking about the entire body politic, right? I think if you talk about the entire bureaucracy, I think it's a lot. You do see, like Taisu said, this also rapid rationalization happening. But and then if you couple that with the party's inscription I was talking about, there is a possibility that down the road the party system and the legal system will, I won't say they will merge into one, but they will become even more integrated than today. But on the other hand, I think there is as Taisu said also, I also agree with you. I think it poses a problem for the party leaders, which is how to deal with this highly sophisticated and efficient machine, right? Of course now, when you have a strong leader like Xi Jinping, who's kind of the supreme leader in control of everything, it's easier to actually dominate and enforce orders into the legal system or the party legal system, whatever you call it. But if we say like 10 years from now or 20 years from now, it depends on the kind of of course the elite politics in China. But if there's a different configuration of elite politics, I think whether that would actually make the legal system more impose more constraints on the for example, when there's a factional struggle in the very top of the party system, then I think the legal system might serve as a kind of a stronger constraint. So I think that's, I mean, either two possibilities. But I think the one thing I want to emphasize here is that if you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, again, I'm not an expert here, but it has always been a revolutionary party, for much of its history. There's this highly kind of rational element in the party ever since Mao Zedong, obviously, but even later generations, you see that there's always this kind of force in the party against rationalization or anti-rationalization. I think that's where I think if you push the legalization or the internal differentiation of the legal system into the party system, I think that's where I think the party would have to somehow deal with that problem. I mean, it's not a problem when you have a very strong central leader, but I think it will be a problem when that central leadership changes. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Right. Great. So those are really interesting points. Before we go to the audience, let me just make one really quick follow-up question, which is, so when you say you think the party has always had a certain kind of like anti-rational revolutionary impulse, that's a very interesting observation, and some people would be inclined to agree, but at the same time, like I'm sure you're aware, like that's also a little bit of a kind of like a contrarian position in some ways, because like there's a pretty mainstream narrative that the party's revolutionary impulses died with Mao, right? Maybe not completely died, but like afterwards, from Deng to Jiang to Hu to Xi, to Xi, like the general trend has been towards more institutionalization of some kind, right? Now, the specific mechanisms of that institutionalization can vary. Who didn't seem to trust the law as much as Xi did. He preferred to go back to like party work. And Xi, while emphasizing law, he also emphasizes like internal struggle meetings in the party, and all these like internal like 运动式执政, things like that. These kind of like these movement-based mechanisms, but nonetheless, right, like none of these guys have ever seemed that interested in kind of like mobilizing mass revolutionary support for their policies. They want, like, everyone wants to maintain control with a pretty iron grip. And most of us would also tend to think that the strength of that grip has strengthened over time, at least from like 1998 to now. It's been like steadily increasing, like how tightly wound the party state seems to be. So in that sense, like when you say there's like a revolutionary impulse right now in the party, what exactly do you mean?
I think I mostly mean that there always this kind of, because if you go back to the, theoretically go back to the Weberian classification of the three kinds of authority, the rational, legal, charismatic, and the traditional. I think there has always been very strong traditional and charismatic elements in the authority in the Communist Party, right? I think, of course, how that manifests in different periods, it manifests differently. I think certainly you just compare the Hu era and the Xi era. I mean, it manifests differently, but that element has always been there. Sometimes it directly influences the legal system, and sometimes it just keeps legal system as kind of very rational and instrumental, but influence other aspects of for propaganda, for example, or other aspects of the governance, right? So, but I think I do think there is that tension, within the party system between rationality and the kind of the traditional or charismatic authority or the revolutionary impulse.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thanks. That's great. So we have two questions right now. One is a question that Tamara sent me through the chat, and then Joyman is the other person on the queue right now. So I'm just going to read Tamara's question because apparently she's connecting through her phone. To Professor Liu, do you predict a pushback by either central state institutions or local government institutions against the central party leadership's increasing incursion into regulatory and legal capacities? If so, what expression might that take?
Well, right now, I don't see a lot of pushback. Right now, it seems like, I think whatever the central leadership wants will be implemented, kind of even legalized. But I think, this actually go back to the Juan's point about formality, why formality matters. Because I do think, general point here is that it's a lot easier to change politics than to change law. even in Chinese law, you can say, oh, you can change the constitution, like remove the term limit, like overnight, right? All of a sudden, the a constitutional the term limit for the president change, right? You can do that, but even that, I mean, revising a law takes a lot of effort, especially after the law is highly legalized. For example, like I did some research on criminal procedure law. I mean, every round of revision took 15 or even 20 years. Right. So once things are, now China have a unified civil code. That's not going to do another comprehensive revision probably 20 years later or even longer. Right. So I think the more these things become stabilized and become institutionalized, I think the harder for the kind of the, politics will always change. There will always be kind of, struggles, pushbacks, and all these things. But I think, again, go back to my earlier response to Taisu. I think when you have a very strong central leader, you don't see a lot of pushback. But when you have a more fragmented authority at the top, or more fractional authority at the top, I think you will see the legal system actually generating more possibilities for pushback. So it's not just like a one way, it's like a knife handle for the party. I think the legal system is a double-edged sword now, can work in both ways.
Great. So we have time for one or maybe two more questions. So Joyman, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Sida. It's been an interesting talk and quite a nice sequel to your monograph on lawyers and stuff. Really interesting to hear that. So my question had a what kind of commercial and financial law bent to it. So I'm wondering, with these areas where the law obviously has a really strong regulatory role, I'm just wondering to what extent does the party's explicit leadership can really play a role in this, in the sense that it will have implications for international contract disputes, or perhaps in other areas like the long jurisdiction of American laws and things like fraud and anti-corruption, or maybe China's own long-arm rules pertaining to Hong Kong, and that will affect how foreign parties have to deal with Chinese law, and clearly a much larger politicization will impact on legal certainty. So I'm just wondering how that works. How would that bit work? And also building on G's question on the international elements, I imagine law is also one dimension of the potential soft power implications for China. I mean, in Asia right now, it's quite a blank sheet. In Japan, for example, public law's role is quite minimal. In Korea, Taiwan, you have the constitutionalization stuff. But otherwise, many other countries, like in Southeast Asia, that isn't really an obvious legal model. So I'm wondering if what China's doing now could appeal potentially to other authoritarian regimes. And I remember speaking to a specialist on Myanmar, asking him what impacts China may have on the law, and he really just had nothing to say. So I imagine maybe there is none. But I'm just wondering to what extent you see that as being an interesting question going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Professor Liu, I'm very much interested in your critique on the dual state concept. So as I understood, I'm not sure if Eva Pilz meant it in a way to say, I'm exaggerating. I'm not sure if she meant it in a way to say that we're facing an imminent risk of China turning into a dystopian society like the Nazi regime, and et cetera, et cetera. I think she was trying to draw attention to the coexistence of these two different sets of rationales, and trying to say that as of now, perhaps we are observing a prerogative state that is increasingly penetrating and co-opting and tightening its grip on the so-called normative state. And I thought, while listening to your presentation, I thought that this would be pretty much in line with the story that you are telling. So I was quite surprised at the end when you said that you don't quite agree with that. So I'm wondering if you can be a little bit more specific about your specific critiques on that. And also you mentioned this spillover effect, which makes you perhaps less pessimistic. And you use the, I think the example of spillover effect of formal rationality from maybe civil law areas to criminal law areas. I'm not sure if it's sufficient to, in that case, when we're talking about, the struggle of formal rationality and maybe what we call political rationale or political will, if it's sufficient to look at different legal areas. I mean, it's certainly true that specifically in China, in perhaps criminal justice, we see a lot more arbitrariness than in civil areas. But still, even in civil law areas or in economic litigations, the party state is perhaps also been increasingly able to have judicial institutions make decisions according to, let's say, policy priorities rather than formal law. So yeah, I think that's, I'm just interested in your response.
Are there any other questions? If not, actually, I will add just a very short observations. I taught contemporary Chinese law courses over last year twice now, and you have used actual readings from both written by Taisu and Sida. So I was very much interested in hearing how you two actually fought out here over whether China is moving toward or against, or somehow finding a middle ground between the movement toward or against the law. But my observations are more related to actually my background as a historian. It seems to me, I mean, Loveman's comment about the fact or the allegation that China didn't have a legal system, I think that was just at least from my perspective, that's a very Orientalist, comment, in the sense that because by definition, what he meant by legal system, that's already not there in the Chinese context, both now and in the past. So that doesn't make much sense to me in the first place. But more importantly, I think one of the things that has been very interesting to me, both in hearing the conversations and also in reading some of the publications by both of you, that is to what extent the way the Chinese, especially the PRC government, has been using the legal system or law, legal institutions and so on to advance its political, economic, social economic agendas are different, substantially different from, or actually similar to some of the ways, for example, the Qing government was using its legal system for sometimes very different purposes. If we are using the Weberian notion of rationality, I mean, he's dismissing the Chinese legal system as much as Loveman. So in the sense, there was no much rationality, certainly not formalistic or formal rationality in the Chinese legal system back then. So we are always, at least I think we can be easily falling into that kind of conceptual trap, because China or Chinese legal system will always be characterized as a traditional or charismatic legal system, because it just doesn't have all the formal elements of what Weber has defined as rationality. But it's that kind of, I think, tendency to juxtapose or even dichotomize Chinese or whatever non-Western legal system with the so-called rational modern legal system. It's, I mean, it can help, I guess, make sense of some of the things that are happening or have happened before, but still it's always, I think, lead us to some kind of dead-end conversations, because we started with a dichotomization between the Chinese, how to say, I don't want to use the word tradition, at least the Chinese institutional, social, cultural practices, as well as their own probably preferences. So I don't know whether we are, I appreciate, I think, Sta's comment about, the resistance to understanding Chinese law in a linear way. So we needed to diversify the approaches, we need to diversify the conceptual frameworks, but also we needed to move beyond, I think, at least from my perspective, the Weberian categorization of Chinese law as always, almost always the opposite or either the kind of the other, from what we consider to be either a rational modern rule of law system or institution. I know China is doing things very differently, but is there any hope of actually trying to understand that as rational, not irrational? So it may be very different from the kind of what we understand in North America or other I guess Asian countries to be rule of law system, but it doesn't mean it's irrational. That's always one of the biggest concerns I have had with the Weber notion of rationality, or many other, like including Montesquieu, Hegel, and so on. Their notion of progress, modernity, and rule of law, certainly. I'm not defending the China legal system in any sense, but I just conceptually, I think we needed to at least put the notion of rationality or rationalization, or even because I think near the end of the talk, Sida actually used the Weber notion of cage. So if you want to clarify or elaborate on that, would be great. But otherwise, we can have a conversation afterwards. So just want to add some of my observations, as from a historical perspective, to the conversation, at least for some people who are more focused on the contemporary issue. Okay, I will stop here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Before I answer, just to clarify, I thought we're ending at 11:30, right? Or 11. I mean, like I'm confused.
We technically we can extend, to 11:30, but mostly some people just simply log off around 11. So, but I think it would depend on you and also Wang Juan and Li Ji, whether you want to stay for another 10 to 15 minutes, just at least to answer the questions. That's completely up to you and the commentators.
Okay, awesome. Because I was, I assume we end at 11:30, so we thought we had plenty of time. Yeah. Anyway, so let me answer a few questions. I think Joyman's question and Ye's question actually are quite related. Although you talk about the things at both aspects. So let me respond to the due state question first, because what I meant that I disagree with Ava Pills about the due state is, I mean, I don't disagree that the prerogative state is trying to impose itself on the normative state. What I want to point out is that, I think it's this almost this hope, or maybe an illusion, I think, of the prerogative state to actually dominate the normative state, which actually also relates to Joyce's question. In other words, to what extent the party can actually control the civil commercial law, or this kind of less political aspect of the Chinese system. What I was trying to say is that yes, that's certainly happening. They were trying to do that, but what I was trying to say is that the so-called normative state has its own logic. And especially, I mean, because what happened in the past 20 years is the internal differentiation, or the rise of kind of increasing formal rationality in the Chinese legal system, is becoming more kind of the most developed in the civil commercial areas of law. And that would actually, what I call spillover, is that would actually not just generate resistance to the imposition or the dominance of the prerogative state, but also actually shape how the prerogative state works. Because, for example, like, you have this, as I said before, you can't have like judges deciding on criminal cases based on a completely different kind of principles, legal principles, or logic, or rules, than the judges deciding on intellectual property cases, or just a divorce cases. So this is, I think, the part. I think the due state, if you see them as two parallel states, and prerogative state was imposed on the normative state, you underestimate the power of the normative state. Right, so that's, I hope that explains. Go back to Joyman's question. I mean, the civil commercial aspect. Yes, there are party influence, there are things, but I really think if you observe what happened, is that I think the Chinese state is actually leaving quite a bit of autonomy in the non-political or less political areas of Chinese law. For example, I mean, if you go to a intellectual property division, like the 知识产权庭 in a court, any court in Shanghai or in Beijing, major cities, you'll be amazed by how professional, how sophisticated, how kind of rational these courts are. I mean, I think they are leaving some aspect, kind of giving them more autonomy, because they don't see them as imposing problem for social stability. Go back to the John's point about restlessness versus arbitrariness. I think the Chinese state can tolerate arbitrariness, but they can't tolerate restlessness. So as long as you don't pose problem to the stability maintenance, to the Weiwen, I think there are actually quite a bit of leeway given to the civil commercial area. That's why you see like if you look at just law professors and lawyers who practice in civil commercial areas, their lives are a lot easier, I think, than the people who practice in criminal law or administrative law. And Joyman's second question about the diffusion, that's actually an interesting question. I think there has been a lot of discussion recently, especially with the Belt and Road, the BRI, talking about the export of Chinese law. I don't actually see that happening, and I don't see it. Also, I don't expect that happening anytime soon. Why? Because like for two reasons. First reason, if you think about China is a civil law jurisdiction, It's not a common law jurisdiction, but the vast majority of the international commercial transactions, cross-border transactions, commercial arbitration use either English law or New York law. So it's very hard for China to impose PRC law, into any of these cross-border transactions. And so that's the first thing. I think that's why Hong Kong is so important to China, because that's the only common law jurisdiction under Chinese sovereignty. So there are a lot of, like I study Chinese law firm. If Chinese law firm really want to truly globalize, they have to go through Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is the only place they can build common law expertise and then go abroad. Right? So that's kind of one aspect of this. The other aspect, if you look at the legal transplant from China to other places, it almost doesn't happen, for the most part. Even you look at the places that are actually happening a little more. For example, Vietnam. I don't know if May is still on the call. Who's expert on the Vietnamese legal system. You see some influence. For example, China revised the criminal procedure law. When Vietnam revised the criminal procedure law, they would, kind of using China as one of the models that they were looking at. So you do see that kind of influence. But if you go on the ground, I never did field work in Vietnam, but my friend Matthew Yee at Oxford and his co-authors, they've done work in Vietnam. If you look at the things on the ground, the law firms, the courts in Vietnam, they never really take Chinese law seriously into consideration. They care a lot more about local law and also Anglo-American law. So I think that I don't see the kind of with the BRI rising, Chinese law is going to diffuse to other places naturally. I think maybe that would never happen. Maybe even if it happened, it would take a long time. I think you will see lawyers, law firms in China go abroad, I think faster than the actual law going abroad. And finally, to Lee's question about the Weberian idea about rationality, I actually agree with you. I think there has always been a tendency, I think in sociology, obviously, but also in other disciplines, to think about legal system in terms of kind of the modernization. Under modernization, of course, is the Weberian notion of legal system, increasingly moving toward formal rational law. So in that point, I agree with you. There's an obvious limit, theoretically and empirically, to using that lens of rationality to think about the legal system. But what I want to emphasize is not because Weber talked about formal rationality. There's not just rationality, also formality. This goes back to Jen's point. I only only a couple of years ago, I actually, because I don't know German, so, but only a couple of years ago, I realized there are actually two different translations of the word formal into English. There are actually two different German words. If you look at Weber's German original writings, when he talks about formal, he actually means two different things. One, he means what later on Pushback called the logically formal rationality. In other words, the legal system internally become very logical, formal, right? So there's internal logic, internal kind of, so that's kind of the part of the formality, kind of what Taisu called the internal logic of the law, similar to that. But the other part of formal, it's about the kind of the formality. In other words, it's about what the legal system look like. Does the legal system kind of has a certain kind of formality, right? So that's a different meaning of formal. So I think, in my paper, what I'm trying to say is not just Chinese law or Chinese legal system become more rational. It's also have become more formal, and the formality matters. And why formality matters is because, if you see the outlook, the shape of the legal system has a party inscription on it, that actually changed the nature of the legal system, no matter how internally rational and internally formal rational it becomes, right? So I think that's kind of where I think some of the tension is. But we can continue this conversation, obviously.
Yeah.
That's a very big theoretical.
Well, nonetheless, thank you so much for staying on a little bit extra. Thank you to the audience also for joining us for this long. Unless anyone else has any questions, I think we can call it a wrap. Oh, there's one more question. So Conan has a question, please.
I just want to make sure if you guys can hear me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's can you speak a little louder? It's a little weak.
Thank you so much for Professor Liu for sharing. I'm just very curious about the future of constitutional review, because recently there has been coverage about constitutional review, and I think the extent that constitutional review has been using was not that optimistic. It has been using to, I think, review one of the local law regarding the local language that used in schools. So it's not going in a, I guess, quote unquote, optimistic direction, but I'm just curious about your perspective on the future of constitutional review. Thank you.
In the Chinese context, I think I'm very pessimistic, actually. I don't think, well, first of all, it depends on what you mean by constitutional review, because there's actually, legally speaking, there's no judicial review of Chinese constitution. Because, you know, like you can't just waive the constitution in the court, say, hey, you know, Mr. So-and-so violated Article 3 of the constitution, you know, we want to file a lawsuit. It has to be based on a specific piece of legislation. You know, like other than the constitution. So in that sense, China, you know, the People's Republic of China at least had never had a kind of a real judicial review of the constitution, right? But of course, that doesn't mean the constitutional law is kind of toothless or useless. I mean, there's a huge symbolic meaning and power of the constitutional law, and that's what I mean. Like the example you gave, the language in local schools in the minority areas, I mean, it's a good example of this. Of course, I mean, you can't sue with the constitution, but if it's in the constitution, it has a symbolic power that can make use of. But, you know, my sense is that, as I said, I'm very pessimistic because I don't really see, there's no kind of incentive, I think, for the party or even for people in the legal system to actually give the constitution more teeth, I think, in the future, because that would only create more trouble. I think, you know, if you think about the constitution from the party state point of view, I think that would only create more trouble for the state, not really enhancing the power of the state in terms of social control. So I don't really see that happening, unfortunately.